Hello and welcome back to the AFL High Performance Podcast for AFL staff and athletes. My name is Jack McLean. I'm your host for today's chat, and I'm lucky enough to have Adriano Arguedas Soley as our guest. Our key topic for today's chat will be around non-invasive monitoring using Submax testing, both for the main group performance as well as some questions around return to play, giving you some tools and solutions perhaps you can reflect on your off-season and bring into your practice for next year. But welcome, Adriano. Thanks for jumping on, mate. Really looking forward to our chat.
Thanks, Jack. Appreciate it. Thanks for having me on.
No doubt those tuning in that have connected on the LinkedIn event, mate, are well aware of your background, working at the GWS Giants and more recently, obviously, Sydney Swans currently. But for those that are tuning in that aren't aware of your background, I guess how it all began, mate, do you mind providing, I guess, where did your passion start for high performance sport and then different work experience you've had along the way, and of course your academic career as well.
Yeah, no worries. I guess I'm originally from Costa Rica. I was probably it's a different story to most S&C coaches. So I was never a good athlete. I was pretty average at all sports. Never really succeeded in any. But I was pretty good in the academic side, or relatively good, I'd like to say. So I came across this topic called sports science, and it was a mix of what I enjoyed doing, which was playing sports, and what I enjoyed studying, which was biology and human biology. And through my studies, I got the chance to go to England and live there for 5 years at the University of Bath, where I did my undergrad and master's. And then, COVID happened, didn't land the job in the UK, so I was back in Costa Rica, and then worked there for a year with the rugby sevens team, which was developing at the time, as an S&C coach. Pretty much juggling a whole host of different roles in that program, to be honest. With it's a developing program, low budget. But yeah, during that time, this PhD, this idea of doing a PhD kept thinking of that, and the opportunity came up through the Giants. And yeah, applied, interviewed, moved over across the world, and yeah, been in Sydney for 4 years now. Wrapped up at the Giants last season. Without finishing my PhD, but in the process still. And now I'm one of three S&C coaches at the Swans and leading the sports science space as well. So a bit of a hybrid role. And just finished up, obviously, the season. Didn't make finals, so now we're just sort of prepping for next year.
Fantastic, awesome, mate. Yeah, a bit of travel in your career so far. That's
Yeah.
great. What made you decide to study in England? Is the sports science program in Bath quite
Yeah,
well
well,
renowned? Or?
yeah. Well, I was in a British school, and our school sort of through scholarship opportunities and that sort of thing sort of guided us to apply to unis in the UK, and I was lucky enough to get that opportunity. Went to visit a few, Loughborough, Bath, and just Durham as well. Fell in love with Bath City, beautiful place, love it, miss it. Great university as well, a lot of great researchers there. So really big focus on developing knowledge, conducting good research, applied research, and yeah, just ended up going there, and would have stayed if I could, but COVID changed everyone's life, so ended up going back
Yeah,
home.
yeah, and it worked out quite well.
Yeah.
Did I guess strongest influences both from an academic perspective, but also as a strength and conditioning coach, like you said, as leading the sports science program, who have been your biggest influences so far that have influenced your philosophy on
Yeah,
performance?
yeah, I saw that question. Hard to. There's obviously you have it's a lot of influences at different points in your life, and no doubt I'll leave a few out. But initially, from Bath, Professor James Betts who's professor in metabolic physiology at Bath, and he really shared with me early on what going through the process of what constitutes good evidence, good research design, and being quite critical on that. Supervised my master's project, so he was definitely a big mentor of mine back then. And Mike McCallett as well at Bath, probably. So he's an S&C coach now at British Bobsleigh, doing his PhD in sprint acceleration biomech at Bath as well. Probably the best S&C delivery I've seen to date, and really influenced my early learnings as an intern when I was studying in England as well. Um, Dr. Shane Ball from University of Sydney. He's a great researcher and also very methodical S&C. I try to catch up with him as often as I can, mainly to get, his smarter and more objective thoughts, unbiased thoughts on things I might be going crazy about. Yeah, I think I can't, not mention Nick Poulos, who, as we were talking earlier, he's wrapping up his 7-year tenure at the Giants, and he sort of took the risk of bringing a uh, Costa Rican in his mid 20s to do some research in AFL in his department. I'd like to think he'll say that worked out well for both of us, but yeah, it was definitely a good opportunity that he provided me with. And yeah, the guys at the Giants, so Andy Murphy, who you've had in your podcast, I think we probably spent the 3 years I was there, training, having multiple coffees, and then consistently sort of challenging each other on training and performance concepts, and then trying to develop ways of or tools to analyze some of those things, and then that would lead to more questions and more arguments, and it was just a cool thing to, yeah, good process, good time there with him. Then obviously my PhD supervisors, Dean Norris, Salil Shushan, and Rick Lovell, who will no doubt talk about them throughout. Yeah, and more recently, Shane Lihan. I probably butchered his last name, but yeah, we've continued to sort of navigate the performance problems and challenges that the AFL has to offer. So yeah, definitely learning from him as well. Probably left a few
Fantastic.
out there, mate. Yeah, it's hard. It's hard.
It's a strong list of world class practitioners, mate. That's some great experience right there. And what about highlights that sort of spring front of mind of your career so far?
Don't know. I think for me, it's more the day to day. We do. I think it's hard not to enjoy the job we do. I think going to work, the challenges we get every day is that's probably the highlights. It's obviously nice when you get some sort of success in competition with whatever team you're working with, but yeah, I like to think that I just sort of enjoy the challenge of going to work in an environment where everyone's sort of high performing and has a pretty good line of direction of where we all want to go and what goals we want to accomplish. And yeah, I think that's probably what does it for me.
Yeah, yeah, a good segue for the next one, mate. Biggest challenges, obviously working in high performance sport while also doing your PhD.
Yeah.
There's lots of pressure there, and no doubt, coping with the huge amount of stress that would crush most. But yeah, what have been some of your biggest challenges, and
Yeah.
what have you learned from facing them?
Yeah, I don't know. Yeah, probably yeah. Doing the PhD at the same time as working full time in elite sport is probably a big challenge. I know a lot of people that have done it and have gone through successfully, so kudos to them. I think that's a challenge. I think just yeah, being able to manage different situations and that you've sort of would never have encountered in your life if you weren't working in sport. I think being able to synthesize everyone's perspectives and sometimes at the expense of what you think is objectively the way to go, but appreciating the bigger picture is sometimes a challenge, but no doubt a big learning as well. Um, yeah, it's obviously as well challenging when you end up connecting with people at the clubs you work with, and particularly players. And when things don't go the players' ways, or the club's way, not making finals as an example, it's obviously it takes sort of a personal toll as well. You start questioning a lot of things, and but I think it's all part of the learnings and the excitement of it as well. Yeah, it was probably some of the few.
100%. Well said, mate. Well, we'll dive into the topic. I guess
Yeah.
if we start with your PhD and non-invasive, monitoring to assess how athletes are, responding to the training. What does that mean for those that perhaps don't study sports science or aren't interested in coaches? And why are you passionate about it? Why did you decide to do a PhD on it?
Yeah, I think, look, I've always been quite interested in what the human body can achieve in general, and part of that sort of the elite performance and the training process that leads to elite performance is something that has always fascinated me, and where the ceiling is and that sort of thing. So part of our responsibility as performance practitioners is obviously managing that training process, when to push, when to pull, and a lot of that comes down to how the players are responding to training. You no one, and supporting the goals of the broader club or group. No one likes to lose, no one likes to get injured. So when I was initially thinking of, right, where do I want to focus my research, is probably in working against those two possibilities, right? And speaking to the guys at Western Sydney Uni and Salil and Dean and Rick, and they were doing some really interesting research on the role of cardiorespiratory fitness in that space, and improving performance, um, understanding training effects a little bit more, and understanding that training effects might look differently when you're talking about the cardiovascular system versus the neuromuscular system, and what the training, how the training dose is basically affecting players, and then how training responses are manifesting. So went into some of Salil's work, and I'd highly encourage everyone to go and search him up and see the work he's done recently. And we started looking at this possibility of having assessments that are embedded in the training process, so they don't take away a lot of time from the training process, and also giving us good insights that might relate to an athlete's maximal cardiorespiratory capacities. And there's a lot of work that has been done in endurance sports and endurance runners along these lines, but the growth of submax tests in applied sports has been massive in recent years. So I guess if you sort of define what a submax fitness test is, it's essentially a protocol where the external load is fixed or standardized, and then you're assessing how the athlete's responding internally. So what that looks like is you can assess RPE, lactate, but they're not as pragmatic and probably not as feasible in terms of not interrupting training, and there's where heart rate derived indices come in. So you fix the intensity of a run in this case. In field sport athletes, it's probably the most relevant one. Just fix the speed of the run, and then once do it for get the boys running at a certain velocity. There's different protocols, but say you're doing a continuous run 4 minutes, and then sample the heart rate response when the heart rate response is stable. So what that looks like is the current protocol we do is a 3-minute run at 13 kilometers an hour, and you sample the last 30 seconds where you'd expect a stable heart rate response. So tracking that over time, what you'd expect is that if you're getting fitter, you'd expect a lower heart rate response. And physiologically, this makes sense, right? So essentially, you're standardizing the intensity. So the response will be basically dictated on the energetic demand of the muscle. That requires a higher, uh, when there's a higher demand that requires a higher cardiac output. Cardiac output's the interaction between stroke volume and heart rate. Stroke volume is limited, so or capped to a certain extent. So your heart rate compensates by upregulating or bringing down your heart rate response. So essentially, a lower heart rate response will suggest that you're getting fitter. And over time, you track this and you start making relationships between an athlete's submax heart rate and their ability to, or their maximal cardiorespiratory capacity. And you see over time that, you get a really good response on, a really good insight into how athletes are responding to training. So I just found that fascinating to start having conversations around, okay, can we get insights into this more frequently? And from that, proactively adjusting the training process and not having to wait till, the end of a preseason to do a time trial, a maximal time trial, and then, close your eyes and hope that everyone got fitter. And I
Yeah,
guess
100%.
that balance between providing more regular insights and then also linking it to good physiological constructs, that's probably what has been motivating me more recently.
Yep, yep. And let's so the 3 minute run, I guess. So like if
Yeah.
we unpack the methods that you guys chose, like is 3 minutes the minimum to what was your rationale with 3 minutes and 13 k's per hour, I guess, for AFL
Yeah.
athlete?
Yeah, so there's quite a bit of research on this, on different protocols and different testing formats, and yeah, I'd probably uh, suggest that any listeners that are interested in this go and search up Salil's research. So essentially, you there's some rules in terms of what the test should look like. You probably want a test that lasts between 3 to 6, maybe 6 is a bit too long, but 3 to 5 minutes is what's typical to elicit a stable heart rate response. And then you also want an intensity that is actually submaximal. So you want a range around 70 to 90% heart rate max. And so the reason for this is that, you're trying to understand what the athlete's, physiological efficiency is or physiological state is. How's the cardiovascular system responding to this intensity? As and the basis for this for the duration of the test is mostly around the stability of the heart rate response, but the intensity of the test, it doesn't seem to matter too much. So other than it being submaximal, you can do one at 12 kilometers an hour, you can do that at 13, 14. As long as it's consistent over time, you can sort of pick your poison. The reason though why it has, if you look at some of the research in running economy and in the 80s and in the 90s, you look that they were already looking at some of this stuff. So there's a researcher by the name of Pete Kavanagh that did a lot of research on Kenyan runners, so the most economical runners in the world. And part of what he saw was that at submaximal speeds, the Kenyan runners compared to highly trained runners would display a lower submaximal heart rate response. But when you expose them to a maximal effort test, like a 10K time trial, they're actually able to reach higher heart rates and sustain those higher heart rates for longer. So there's this idea that the the most the athletes with greater cardiovascular capacity have the ability to be efficient at submaximal speeds or submaximal intensities, but are also able to tolerate higher levels of exertion at maximal effort. And this makes sense, right? Because part of the adaptive responses of both cardiac and skeletal muscle are an improved fatigue tolerance, right, to contractions. So an athlete that's more trained, it makes sense that they have a higher tolerance to harder and more aggressive and more frequent contractions at maximal effort. But the reverse is also true, where at a submaximal speed there or submaximal exertion, they also find that less costly, they're more efficient. So to bring it back to your initial question, I think part of what makes submax tests fascinating is that they actually give you really good insight into the cardiovascular function of the athlete and how they're tolerating submaximal intensities. And now there's even more and more research from the lab and from the field as well, showing good correlations with time trial performance, for example. And the correlations seem to be sort of moderately strong, quite strong, point R equals zero point 0.6, zero point 0.7, but not perfect. So what that tells us is that it's just a proxy measure, right? It's not your criterion measure of cardiovascular fitness. So, and the reason for that is that running performance or max running performance is not only dictated by your physiology, it's also dictated by mechanical determinants. There's a paper I cite a lot. It's called, I can't remember the first name, but Saunders. It's factors affecting running economy that John Hawley's in it as well. So they break down all the determinants of running economy, which differentiate elite runners from highly trained runners. And part of their mechanical determinants or the mechanical determinants they talk about is the ability to, minimize movement of the center of mass and
Yep.
also um, attack the ground with high levels of stiffness and making sure that that stiffness continues at higher intensities or higher speeds. And so the reason why the relationship between submax heart rate and running performance is never going to be perfect is because we're only capturing one element that explains the variance in maximal running performance. But the beauty of submax tests is how frequently we can do them because they're so low key, you know,
Mm.
we can get pretty regular insights into it. So you can essentially and probably something that you do have to mention when you talk about submax monitoring is that your heart rate response will be influenced by a lot of things on the day. Poor sleep, variable caffeine ingestion, fatigue potentially, peer interaction. So you get this thing in footy players, you no doubt having worked in footy yourself and in rugby league, they'll start chatting and they'll start pushing each other for whatever reason. It's just the environment sort of promotes that, right? So
Yeah.
being able to do it repeatedly over time allows you to smooth out those sort of influences. Um, so long story short, I think the practical takeaways of my experience so far with submax testing is one, do it regularly enough so that you can smooth out those, contextual influences and have more confidence in the findings you're seeing. But then also pick one protocol and stick to it. There's a few rules, as I said, 3 to 5 minutes to expect a stable heart rate response, sub-maximal intensity, and yeah, something that's just pragmatic. In the AFL setting, it's pretty easy to just do it around the oval. 450 meters around the oval, cap it every 50 meters, and then pick your speed. I've done 12, I've done 13, doesn't matter. Just pick one and make sure it's always done um, to the same rigor.
How often is optimal across your preseason, and does that change in season?
Yeah, so what I've been used to is doing it once a week in the preseason. Um, for some reason, in the AFL context, 6 day breaks are seen as a congested period. So we don't typically do them on 6 day breaks, but try and do it as regularly as possible. Um, Martin Bushait will speak around the day before testing, and how he wouldn't do them the day after rest, or particularly in days after travel. And the reason for that is that, the bodily fluids will change depending on, changes in time zone. If you have a full rest day versus if you train the day before. So all that will also influence the end outcome measure. Um, if you have 3 days, there's also some research suggesting that your acute load might affect your heart rate response. So we typically think of the heart rate response in a submax test as showing fitness changes, but we can also see changes in in exercising heart rate that might actually be related to an acute response to an acute bout of training. And a lot of that initiated through some of Tanit Scott research in rugby league, actually, where you're working now and at the Broncos, but the sport you're working now. And um, essentially, what he found, him and Sean McLaren were involved in that paper, I believe, was that um, the heart rate response in a submax test seemed to be more influenced by your training load over the last 3 days as opposed to over the last month, which is counterintuitive because you'd expect that, a month worth of training will be more representative of your chronic training status than the last 3 days. So all of a sudden we started thinking, they started proposing, and I reading this paper, I started thinking, well, maybe that, monthly rolling average is not necessarily a good indicator of your chronic fitness status. Or potentially your heart rate response in a submax test might be dictated by the training you've done in the short term. So long story short, yeah, there's a lot of mechanisms that have been proposed, whether this can be a measure of fatigue or a change in parasympathetic status, or whether you know that it might be there might be an acute benefit that's being manifested. So there's things like plasma volume expansion that will essentially suggest that your blood's more viscous or runnier, so therefore your heart's having to, after a period of intensified training, so your heart's not having to work as hard to pump the blood around your body. So influences like that, and having a good standardized protocol around where the test is scheduled. So if you're always going to do it on a T1, for example, on the 72 hours post game, I would always do it, make sure it's always done on that particular day. I wouldn't, flip and change between when it's done during the week because of these sorts of influences. Does that make sense? I do tend
Yeah,
to
yeah, definitely.
do tend to deviate a little bit
So
from
yeah,
the question, but
so T1. So first thing the athletes do before any footy, I imagine, and do you take them through a light dynamic warm up and then they go into the test, or does that, uh, or can you? Is it safe enough to just roll straight out to into that steady state run?
yeah, you'd think so, right? So it's 12 to 13 Ks an hour. You're talking about a very, very light jog. You played sports growing up, so did I. This is the benefit of submax tests. Growing up before training starts, everyone goes for a lap around the oval or two, right? So it's essentially that.
Almost like a flush run sort of thing for the
It's
boys.
almost, yeah, it's exactly right. It's exactly that. It's a flash run. It's standardized. It's always the same. And it's the way I've done it is, yeah, it's the first thing, the first activity in training. The one thing that, without saying too much is that we were seeing in my last paper of my thesis is that the starting heart rate in that test, so where a player starts, will have an influence on their end stage heart rate. And the reason why I think this is interesting is quite pragmatic because no doubt, you've been in this environment. You're sorting everyone with their heart rate belt, with their GPS. And at the same time, the guys that already have their GPS and their heart rate, they're already kicking a footy or running around the oval. So before the tests start, there's this possibility that some players might start the test at an elevated heart rate. And therefore, they might reach a higher heart rate in the end stage of the test. So the ability to account for that effect is something that we're looking into. But then there's also the easiest thing. I mean, the most practical thing. I shouldn't use the word practical because the most obvious thing would be to get the players to rest prior to starting the test. But I looked into this as well, into what's out there in the research on heart rate response in exercise following a preceding bout of exercise. And it will probably take around 3 minutes, as long as you cross that 80% heart rate zone, 3 minutes for your heart rate to actually stabilize to rest. And that applies across a range of preceding intensities. So if you think about this, imagine getting a full squad of 44 AFL players to stand still for 3 minutes before doing a submax test. You already get enough stick for doing it in the first place. At the Giants in particular, every single time we did the submax test, it was all about, oh, are we doing this for Adriano's PhD again? And it's like we're actually doing this because it's giving us good information to look after you and make sure you're in the best possible cardiovascular state to perform. So yeah, just practically we're probably without, again, as I said, without saying too much, we're in the next few months we're probably gonna publish one or two studies showing how can we actually advance our analysis of this and account for those subtle differences and therefore, reduce the error of these measures as well.
Yep, yep. And across, I guess, using this submax test to guide prescription, I guess there's a few scenarios there, but maybe if you're doing an in-season, for those athletes that are quite data centric and they're quite interested in this sort of stuff, the few of them, and you're seeing perhaps a decrement in their fitness in season, that could potentially create maybe a bit of anxiety.
Yeah.
How do you go about managing if you have faced that situation before, where obviously mindful of, like you said, there's already conflicting interest with travel, turnarounds. There's not a lot of windows in season to get a lot of load and chase fitness, but I guess perhaps once you find it early enough, at least it's not a bigger problem where it's showing up on game day down the track.
Yeah.
But yeah, talk us through, I guess, the practical implications of decisions that this has helped with, maintaining or perhaps developing some fitness throughout preseason and in season.
Yeah, no worries. So I think prior to that, if we take a step back, I think when you're interpreting some of this data, it's pretty key to be confident on what's a meaningful change. So if you look at the error of measurement of a submax heart rate measure, and this is from basically a big work that Salil did. I'd definitely get him on the podcast if you can. He'll tell you more in more depth about this. But essentially, he looked at all the studies that have ever been done and came out with an estimate of retest reliability of submax exercise heart rate, and it came around like 1.6% points. But obviously, the heart rate technology doesn't give you 0.6, so it's around 1 to 2% points. So if you look at what the typical error actually means, it's essentially how much the measure is going to vary when you expect no change. So it's essentially just a normal fluctuation of the measure. So anything inside 1 to 2% points, you'd suggest it's just measurement error. From that, you go on to, okay, what's the minimum detectable change? And in science, you'd essentially want a 95% confidence. So the typical error covers 68% of all possible measures. You'd want 95%, and that's not as pragmatic in applied sports because obviously it's a pretty quick environment. So you'd use something like an 80% confidence interval. And from that perspective, you'd be looking at 2.5 to 3.5% points. So anything above that, let's say 3% points, you'd say, okay, it's outside the measurement error, so something's happened physiologically. Other than that, you'd look at, okay, so what's a change that we think would relate to something that we give a shit about. So, for example, time trial performance, MAS. Um, Again, Martin, so a lot of what happens is you dive into these measures and you realize that someone's already researched this. So Martin Bouchard did a big body of work in this space, and they came out with having studied a lot of different associations between time trial performance and submax heart rate, that around a 5% point change in submax heart rate would associate with 0.5 to 1 kilometer per hour change in MAS. So when you got a change that big, then you can be somewhat confident that that actually will translate to running performance. However, as we've discussed earlier, there's a lot of contextual influences that need to be accounted for. And, a one-off drop in of 5% or of 5% is unlikely, but of 3 to 4% might not necessarily tell you that, someone's improving their fitness, and a one-off increase isn't telling you that someone's, you know, getting less fit or losing fitness. So then you move around. Okay, so how many measures, we're doing this often enough. So how many measures are we comfortable are showing us that this player is losing their fitness? So practically you'd look at, okay, over the last three tests, what's the pattern? Okay, is it, 3 straight points going up? Therefore, there's a gradual increase in their heart rate response for the same test. Therefore, you're pretty confident that that's a detraining effect. When you see that, then okay, you start looking at other measures. Is the player performing well? How's his outputs been? How are their markers, like their neuromuscular markers, going? And then you try and put the picture together and say, okay, nothing's nothing else is flagging, so let's just keep an eye on it and see what he tests next week and then assess. Or everything else is flagging, he's losing strength, his running outputs are going down, therefore he's a candidate for a top up. In pre-season, it's a lot easier, as you said, because of the congestion of the fixture congestions in season makes it a little bit difficult. But in pre-season, what you do is you do it every test, you do it every week, and essentially you track the trend over time. So you've got a 15-week pre-season, you exclude the Christmas break, so you should be getting more than 10 assessments in the pre-season. And then you look at the slope of that trend. So this is again a new sort of analytical technique that has been put forward, and essentially you just take the gradient of that slope over time, and if that gradient equates to about 5% points, then you've done a decent job at improving their fitness over the preseason. Assuming that you've progressively overloaded them, they've gradually been exposed to higher training loads, and they're pretty their runs looking good. That's just a bit of confirmation. In season, yeah, no doubt you're restricted by how much you can do. But then again, we've been in situations where you'd know this from working in AFL. The game is such a big stimulus throughout the week. So if the moment a player gets, repeatedly selected as a sub, for example, or gets consistently subbed out, they're losing a big chunk of their cardiovascular stimulus. If a player, for example, gets suspended or goes through injury or gets for some reason is withdrawn from games, then that's when you really start putting all these pieces of information together and say like, okay, this makes sense that his submax heart rate's creeping up. And now there's so many modalities with which you can stimulate. You can provide a cardiovascular stimulus. It can be in the pool. It can be off legs, but there's no hiding that running and running-based conditioning will provide the strongest stimulus of all those modalities. So the challenge is if you're not gonna run the players, then something has to come up if you're going to use an off-feet modality. Is that volume? Is that intensity? Is that density? Is that bringing the rest down? What is it? But it's just not energetically equivalent. So yeah, there's a bit to navigate there. I think yeah, having a good understanding of what adaptation you're chasing, what's the contextual information around the submax test telling you, and what's the that long-term trend telling you as well, as opposed to those one-off changes.
And I guess talking to the fact that, in football codes typically is
Yeah.
pre-seasons where you do a lot of your work, and in seasons where it's probably more, prioritize the game load becomes 50-60% of the week, generally speaking. So you're going from, 5 solid, physiological sessions in preseason a week to perhaps 3, maybe sometimes 2. What have you seen over the years monitoring submax testing for, is there a drop off across the season?
Mhm.
Is it significant? Does the game actually keep the players in pretty good nick if they're playing regularly enough with a couple of training sessions in the week? Does that actually hold them in good stead, or
Um, you got me? Yep.
perhaps as a in the direction of sports science, do we maybe actually should increase the outputs in season?
Sorry, Jack. Can you
Oh
hear
yeah,
me?
just internet
Yeah.
just paused there. Yeah, yeah. So
No, that's
yeah. So just
yeah.
did you get the question there, Adriano, or do you want me to
Yeah, yeah,
repeat that?
I think so. Yeah, so in the context of games and is basically are the games enough to keep, players fit? Yeah, I think so. Look, so the part of what I've seen through my research, but also through practice, is that as you said, and as you'd expect, the biggest changes occur in the preseason, and then the variation, assuming that players are consistently training and consistently playing games in season, is very very minimal. The issue comes when there's, as you said, like there's interruptions to match participation. The AFL is quite unique in the comparison, as you said, between what the game load represents in terms of the week and what training represents. It's such a hard game. Like the players after a game, like it's very rare that you get a player that on a T1 is is ready to go, having played a full game and ready to go in terms of top up conditioning. But we also need to remind ourselves that your cardiovascular fitness is your number one buffer of fatigue. It's your controllable buffer of fatigue, neuromuscular fatigue, and residual fatigue. So there's a really fine balance between not training too little, and then being able to identify the windows where you can go, right? So we if you look, there's two lenses. There's a lens of let's maintain fitness. We're comfortable with how our players are performing, how they're recovering after games, how they're recovering in between sessions. If you're comfortable with that, and you don't think that's a problem that needs addressing, then you'd probably suggest that a regular in-season program, or at least what I've seen, is probably about right, assuming they're having full training participation, full game participation. But then the caveat to that is, well, do we actually want to develop qualities in season? Do we actually want to, the year it's a long year to think that, we're gonna be humming in finals, you know, do we actually need a bit more? And there's no doubt there's teams doing that nowadays, not only in the AFL, but in different codes and different football codes. There's teams that are ramping up loads, went before the most important events of the year, i.e. finals, that because they're not comfortable with where they are and they know that the opposition's also getting better. So there's a fine balance. I think this comes down to the grand decision maker, really, which, it's not the sports scientists typically. Um, so the short answer would be have a good assessment of, how we're performing. Um, have a good assessment of what was our fitness state or, physiological state going into the season or ending the preseason going into the season. See where we're standing relative to that, and then see if you actually want to, push a bit more. Because if players are all good to go, they should probably go. You're obviously not going to, push someone that's giving you clear signal that they're under recovered or that they're, not coping with the training dose or with the current program, or they've had a few full games. They're not recovering well in between sessions. They're reporting, fatigue, and this is the thing. Like when there's when people talk about submax heart rate potentially being a fatigue measure, and you see these sudden drops in heart rate, it's very unlikely that your heart rate will drop due to fatigue and everything else will be fine. If you're in a fatigued state where, you have a sudden drop in heart rate, something else, if that's attributed to, training load or repeated exertion, then something else is going to flag. So I think yeah, it
And
it's
drugs and
combining, yeah, it's combining different sources of information, and yeah, just having a good assessment of, are we comfortable with where our performance level is, and can we afford to push? Can we afford to, raise the floor as well?
going back to Martin's work, when you see a 5% increase over a few weeks,
Mm.
if you've got uh, athletes in MAS groups to suit their sort of where they sit, do you wait for the 2K time trial to change those groups, or do you use the submax to guide? Okay, I think we can push this athlete. They're showing signs of increased fitness. We need to
Yeah.
change the group that they're running in.
Yeah, you'd like to think that you'd get on top of a gradual increase of 5% points before it actually happens. And you'd fight against it. Because if it's gradual, it's going to happen over a number of weeks, right? Assuming you're doing the tests each week. So I would always bias, prescribing training or running loads, conditioning running, based on the athlete's maximal capacities as opposed to a submaximal measure. The submaximal measure is basically a surrogate. It's giving us a rough indication. It's not perfect on the athlete's ability to cope with submaximal stress. Um, so you'd still bucket them by their maximal performance and their maximal performance levels, and you'd prescribe conditioning based off that. But what you'd use the submax for is just to get regular insights of, okay, this is not the MAS might have changed. We tested them at the end of preseason or whenever that was. It might have changed, so it might be a good argument to say, okay, this player is now going to that group,
Yeah,
and that's fine. Then you obviously have to use your coaching eye to gauge whether they're actually making the reps, and nobody. Ooh, excuse me. Um, let me just. Sorry, Jack. I'll be 1 second.
no worries.
Sorry, Jack.
All
Yes,
good.
sorry. It just becomes an objective measure to assess whether, yeah, a player is ready to progress or not. And this balance between um, testing, submaximally regularly and testing maximally is a fascinating space, right? Because um, you you get good insights, but you don't get perfect insights into an athlete's running capacity or cardiovascular or cardiorespiratory fitness with the submax test. You just get it more often, or you get a sort of you gauge it more often. There's this is a funny story. So on LinkedIn, so Ted Polglaze, never met him in never met him in my life, but he's done some great work with Hockey Australia, and I really like that he's quite vocal on LinkedIn, on things he has strong opinions on and whatnot. I actually think our field's probably missing that. I actually rate people, expressing their views on certain topics. And a friend of ours, Lockie McKenzie, published some work on, looking at dose response relationships between submax heart rate tests and training load in female soccer players. And Ted commented something around we need to test maximally. And I obviously know that Lockie's work is excellent, and some of his findings were advanced the field of submax monitoring a lot. So I was like, I really like what Ted's saying here, because I do think if you can get the best measure possible or the best insight possible, you should. But there's also the pragmatics of doing it regularly enough. So I commented and I think he laughed. It's like, okay, test maximally, monitor submaximally, and train maximally as
Yep.
well.
Yeah,
And
yeah, yeah.
yeah, and then he reacted to that, which is funny. So yeah, I think you need both. You need both. You're just sort of,
It's often the way, isn't it?
yeah, you're essentially getting like you don't test maximal strength every week, for example, but
Yeah,
you test a CMJ every week, which will give you some sort of indication of the athlete's, you know, force production capabilities or their neuromuscular systems state. So that's exactly the submax. It's our cardiovascular equivalent of the CMJ, if that makes
yeah,
sense.
yeah, yeah. Yeah, 100%. It's a good way of framing it. That makes a lot of sense. For like last one, just to wrap it up, the topic, for like strength and conditioning coaches, sports scientists
Mhm.
that don't use submax monitoring and are looking to bring it in next year, what have been some common mistakes to perhaps avoid? Like you're talking about the practical sort of logistics of it, like you said, you don't want to. You got to understand the population what you're working with. It's not might not be best practice, but it's close enough. For example, like not getting the AFL athletes to stand still for 3 minutes before performing the test. So, what are some other tips around if you're looking to bring this into your process that you'd recommend?
Um, yeah, I mean, I think the less visible it can look as a test, probably the better, if that makes sense. So
Mhm.
if you're the last thing you want is for a 3-minute jog around the oval to take away from football, right? So if you can sort of either do it or sorry, do it on the day that it disrupts training the least, i.e., your, you know, your session where you're not doing match play, for example, or you're not doing drills where the coaches, who are conscious of how much load you're doing, and they look at, even though we know that not all load is equal. If you think that that's going to take away from football, probably think about doing it on a different day. Obviously, with all the considerations that we spoke about, scheduling during the week. Try and make it as invisible as possible. So, if I could, I think it's hard because now, on social media, I'm talking about Submax and some of the players are seeing it, and it's hard not to tell them it's a test. But if in the best case scenario, you can say like, oh, we're just going for a jog around the oval, we're just going to pace it. And they don't even know they're being tested. That's one of the beauties of Submax. You can't cheat your heart rate. So if they don't even know they're being tested, um, even better. Try and be quite clear around the expectation of, not talking, not pushing each other, not bouncing the footy, because all that noise adds up, and you probably want to limit how much it influences your measure, which is eventually going to influence your decision making. So
And yeah, return to play, return to performance, how can submax testing be, help the reconditioning practitioners with their decision making and managing athletes? Yes.
Yeah, so I think it's probably, and this, I know this is something you were keen to discuss, and I've sort of gone on a tangent here a bit, but it happens. So I think it's probably most relevant for longer rehab processes. So we know that your maximal cardiorespiratory capacities, depending on a variety of factors like your baseline fitness, your physiological profile, the extent and length of your inactivity, they can decay anywhere between, as quick as 2 weeks and as long as 8 weeks, right? So reductions in VO2 max of like greater than 10%, I think, have been documented beyond 4 weeks. So if you've got a 2 week rehab, then it's probably, you just sort of, you know, um, keep them moving. But if you've got an extended rehab and there's a possibility that an athlete might actually decondition, then it's probably a good idea to get regular insight into this. So, strength recovers pretty quickly, and we've got that space covered quite well in terms of our measures. Whether you want to increase strength or not, it's actually quite funny because we often pat ourselves in the back and say like, oh, actually in rehab we've made someone stronger. But then you look at the change and it's actually, okay, for that measure, it's not even outside of a meaningful change. So essentially, the player's just healed. We haven't made him stronger. He's just healed. He's got a little bit less fatigue because he's not training. But what's his submax heart rate doing? Okay, let's have a look. It's actually trending in the wrong direction. Okay, so a player is actually just healed. They're less fatigued, so they're fresh. It's not necessarily a good thing because a healthy degree of fatigue, which the main program typically tends to provide, can be protective. Players get injured when they're fresh, and they can produce enough force to actually injure themselves, right? So the players say it's fresh, they've recovered their strength or they've healed, in other words. But how physiologically ready are they to return to the rigors of match play and to recover from games and recover from sessions well? And this is where I think we can look at, particularly if you have historical data for a player, where are they based on their best physiological state? Where are they based on their pre-injury levels? And what's that trend telling us? How long is it going to take for this player to get back to where they were physiologically? Um, yeah, I hope that answered the question.
It was in great detail, mate. Appreciate it. That's I've got 2 pages of plenty of notes on the topic. It's clearly something you're well versed in, mate, and you can tell you understand it really clearly and be able to explain it for no matter the scientists tuning in or anyone that might not work in sport. I feel like they've got a pretty good understanding of the value of submax testing. Couple of more sort of personal / professional questions, I guess, to get to know Adriano in a different note. Work life pet peeves, anything that sort of fires you up from an industry perspective?
Yeah, I was going to ask you what pet peeve meant. I love these Australian sayings. So, I'm not, I'm not sure about making me angry. I guess like sometimes I get frustrated a little bit when there's, confident causal inferences and there's not much, robust causal evidence. And that probably applies to research and practice. So you see some pretty interesting claims in the research, but then we're also very often guilty of making some pretty crazy assumptions in practice. And yeah, I think just taking a step back and saying like, okay, what's the extent of the evidence for what I'm actually proposing here? So yeah, sometimes, no doubt, my people that have worked with me in the past might be laughing right now and saying, "Oh yeah, he gets angry at this or that," and it's probably something I need to work on. But yeah, I think I think we have to be very, very aware. We have a big responsibility in terms of like athletes put their careers in our hands, and we have to be pretty confident on the decisions we're making. And I know sometimes we won't always have the confidence, but if we can always say like, I'm not sure what this means. That's fine.
Yeah. Well said. That's awesome, mate. And what about favorite way to spend a day off?
Um, well, I could probably lie to you and say like I like going for a coffee, reading a book, reading an article, but the reality is if I have the choice, I just have a sleep in and you know go for a good feed and lift some weights at some point during the day and yeah, don't know. Completely disconnecting from work. I think that's pretty
Yeah,
important.
recharge.
It's
Yeah.
hard when you're doing a PhD at the same time. I think that'll definitely change next year. I'll have like because your off day becomes your uni day. Um, so I think next year that'll change. I might have to get a dog or something. Yeah.
That's awesome, mate. Exciting times. And what about, do you have a popular opinion or belief that goes against mainstream sort of popular consensus?
Um, don't know. You can probably tell this, but and I'm actually not sure this is against mainstream thinking. I think it'd be a pretty even split, or at least 30-70. But I genuinely think, and I say this quite strongly, that there's higher risk in training too little than there is in training too much. Um, Particularly in this sort of modern age of load monitoring, data can be very helpful, but it can also be dangerous. So I think, high performance departments and high performance in general should be data informed, but not data driven. If that makes sense.
100%. No, it definitely does. And we're obviously at the pointy end of middle of September of 2025. So I guess what are you excited about for the rest of this year? And you've touched on next year not having PhD duties, hopefully. So I imagine that's
Yeah.
your excitement this year. But yeah, what are you excited about for the rest of this year, mate?
Yeah, I'm obviously excited for it'll be my fifth season in the AFL. So, yeah, as you said, selfishly excited about handing in that thesis. And I said to you before we started, I'm going back home next week for the first time in almost 4 years. So since I moved to Australia, so that's pretty exciting. But in terms of yeah, next year, yeah looking forward to another year and. Um, yeah, especially this last paper. I think, without saying too much, I really think it might, this last project might give us good, methods to better interpret a lot of this data that I've been talking about and actually have a better appreciation and understanding of contextual covariates in the heart rate response. So I'm excited to get that out there. I haven't really been as excited to get a paper out like this one. So yeah, hopefully it gets in somewhere.
Oh, absolutely. We'll definitely those research papers that you recommended for those listeners to check out that you referenced throughout the chat. Might get them off you off air and put them in the show notes. And then, of course, when your PhD thesis is, are you going to make it public, the research paper?
Yeah, well, the research papers, if as long as they get published, they should be accessible to the
Okay.
public. But yeah, the thesis, I don't know. I think so. Haven't thought
Yeah.
that far, to be honest. Yeah.
Yeah, well, the research papers anyway. We'll add the links
Yeah.
to those.
Yeah.
And,
Yeah.
yeah, thanks again, Adriano, for jumping on, mate. I've thoroughly enjoyed the chat, and thanks for not only giving some gems and tips, but also quite a detailed insight into the rationale of why this is an important thing for sports science and industry coaches to bring into practice to make informed, well researched decisions.
Thanks, Jack. Thanks for having me. Good work with your podcast. I've listened to it for a while, so yeah, thanks for inviting me on.
Fantastic. Appreciate
Hopefully,
it, mate.
hopefully I didn't ramble too much.
No, not at all. Not at all. It was good chat. And thanks for everyone that's tuned in. I know a few of you looking at the numbers have tuned in halfway through, so I recommend listening to the start. This will live on our YouTube channel until we release it on our podcast, so you can find it there for the full chat with Adriano. Our next live chat will actually continue the sports science theme. We've got Josh Ruddy on, sports science at Essendon Football Club, so looking forward to chatting with him We've currently penciled in the 19th of November, but I'll update you all on when we finalise that date. So yeah, thanks for tuning in, guys. I'll see you on the next episode.